They say the prairie remembers those who suffer in silence. Out there beneath the endless, wind-scoured sky, memories don't vanish, they settle like dust on saddle leather, dry and clinging. Ezekiel Hart had been alone so long, even the crows didn't startle when he passed. He rode like a man welded to his horse, part spirit, part shadow, a fixture of the land. At 48, he carried himself like a man older. Not from age, but weight, the invisible kind that bent your spine over time. His ranch sat on a forgotten bend of the Colorado plains, where sagebrush grew thick and the sun fell hard. Once the place had thrived. Before the war. Before his brother Jonah rode off one morning and never came back, leaving Ezekiel to mend both fences and grief with equal futility. Since then, the ranch had withered. Weeds curled around fence posts. The old corral creaked like it was mourning. And Ezekiel, he moved through it all with the silence of a man who no longer expected change. He rarely rode into town, and when he did, the townsfolk of Cotton Briar made space for him like he carried disease. No one spoke directly to him unless forced. Children were shushed if they stared. The storekeeper slid goods across the counter without eye contact. And always, behind his back, came the same hush of judgment. That Hart man, something's wrong in his head. Talks to ghosts, they say. Ain't natural, the way he just watches. Ezekiel didn't mind. He preferred it, in truth. The silence. The predictable rhythm of chores. The unspoken pact between him and the land. He wouldn't ask much of it if it didn't ask much of him. Each morning, he rose with the cold and moved with a kind of slow, practiced devotion, feeding the horses, mending the gate, patching a roof that would never quite hold. But that morning, the one that cleaved his life into before and after, began like all the rest, quiet, still, broken only by the distant cry of a hawk. He stepped out with coffee in hand, heading toward the barn, when he noticed something out by the east fence. At first, he thought it was a mirage. 5 figures, kneeling, motionless as stones. His first instinct was caution. The plains didn't deliver gift. Trouble had a habit of arriving disguised as need. He approached slowly, boots crunching over frost-hardened dirt, hand grazing the handle of the rifle slung at his back. They were women. 5 of them. Dust-covered, trembling, dresses torn by thorns and sun alike. Not a sound came from them. Their heads were bowed, as if in prayer or punishment. The eldest, maybe late 20s, maybe early 30s, lifted her chin and met his eyes. Something in her gaze held no fear, only the stripped-down steadiness of someone who had already survived worse. "You Ezekiel Hart?" she asked. Her voice was rough, cracked at the edges like she hadn't used it in days. He gave the faintest nod. "They said you take in strays." He looked from one face to the next. Each woman wore her pain differently. The youngest, barely more than a girl, clutched a ragged shawl tight around her shoulders, her lips blue with cold. One woman had a fading bruise on her cheekbone. Another gripped the hand of the girl beside her like it was all that tethered her to the earth. Ezekiel didn't answer. He didn't need to. He turned, walked toward the gate, and swung it open. They followed without a word, as if they'd been waiting for that gesture more than any promise. Inside, he pointed toward the bunkhouse. It hadn't seen use in years, but it still stood, stubborn and sturdy like everything he kept close. They stepped inside, glancing around with the wary grace of deer newly freed from a trap. He lit the stove, fetched water, set bread to warm. The eldest woman, he would learn later her name was Magnolia, watched him closely, her expression unreadable. "We'll work. We ain't here to loaf." He grunted, neither acceptance nor refusal. He hadn't had a soul on the ranch in years. The quiet had been his companion. But somehow this silence, the one they brought, felt different. Not empty, but suspended. Like the air before rain. That night the wind sang low through the chimney. Ezekiel sat on the porch, pipe unlit in his hand, eyes scanning the sky like it held answers. Behind him, faint sounds of movement came from the bunkhouse, Someone crying, another pacing, the groan of old beds under unfamiliar weight. He didn't sleep much. In the morning, he found the women already awake. Magnolia was boiling water on the outdoor fire pit. The girl with the bruised cheek, her name would later be known as June, was hanging linens that hadn't been washed in a decade. The youngest, Delia, smiled at a chicken like it was a long-lost friend. Ezekiel stood for a moment, unnoticed, and observed. There was no chatter, no demands. Only motion. Purpose. He felt something shift in his chest. Not pain exactly, but its echo. The unfamiliar ache of something awakening. He brought tools to the edge of the field and left them beside the plow. Magnolia saw, nodded once, and rolled up her sleeves. That afternoon, the wind turned bitter. A storm hinted at itself along the western ridge. He returned to the porch, watching clouds bruise the sky, when he noticed Delia huddled beneath the eaves, eyes wide with worry. She didn't speak. Just reached out, gently touching the hem of his coat as though asking permission to stand near. He let her. They stood like that until the cold chased her back inside. 3 days passed in slow, quiet rhythm. The ranch no longer groaned with stillness. It breathed, cautiously, like a wounded thing testing its legs. Meals were shared without words. Chores were done without being asked. The bunkhouse light flickered into the night like a heartbeat newly returned. Ezekiel began to listen. To their footstep. To the way June hummed as she brushed the horses. To how Delia laughed only when she thought no one heard. He learned to recognize Magnolia's silences, not empty, but full of unsaid things. He never pried. Yet, even with the growing rhythm, unease stalked the edge of his mind. He knew what the townsfolk would say if they learned. 5 women, broken and beautiful, living under his roof? He could already hear the sneers, the ugly assumptions. Cotton Briar loved a scandal more than a sunrise. But as he watched Delia skip stones across the pond, and Magnolia carry wood twice her size, he felt something hard and stubborn rise within him. Let them talk. By the end of the week, the ranch no longer looked abandoned. A wash line fluttered in the breeze. The windows glowed warm come evening. And Ezekiel Hart, who had forgotten what it felt like to be needed, began to stand a little taller. He didn't know who would come knocking next. Trouble had a long memory. But for now, his gate was open. And the prairie, for the first time in years, felt like home again. By the second week, the rhythm between them no longer felt borrowed. The ranch had become a kind of breathing thing again, pulsing with life in a way Ezekiel hadn't allowed himself to remember. Magnolia oversaw chores with quiet precision, her sleeves rolled and her hair tied back in a no-nonsense braid. June's voice, once barely above a whisper, now sang soft melodies to the horses as she brushed them. Delia bloomed with every passing day, her innocence not diminished by hardship but reshaped into resilience. The other 2 girls, Clara and Ruth, spoke little but worked hard, their silences stitched with a kind of trust that needed no explaining. Ezekiel remained who he was, quiet, watchful, solitary. But something in his presence shifted. He no longer drifted around the ranch like a ghost. He existed among them, sharing morning coffee, passing tools, nodding at their small successes. They never pressed him for words, and in return, he offered his steadiness like shelter. There were no confessions, no grand speeches, just shared moments under the same sun. But peace, Ezekiel knew, was not a thing that lasted long in a town like Cotton Briar. It came in the form of Sheriff Clay Maddox, a man with a badge, a silver tongue, and a heart full of suspicion. He rode in with 2 deputies, their horses kicking up dust as they approached the ranch just before dusk. Ezekiel heard them before he saw them, the metallic jingle of spurs and the self-importance of boots slapping hard earth. The women froze when the horses crested the ridge. Magnolia instinctively moved in front of Delia, and Clara's hand brushed the hilt of the kitchen knife she'd been using to slice apples. Sheriff Maddox didn't dismount. He simply sat tall in his saddle, his gaze sweeping over the homestead with the thinly veiled contempt of a man used to having his way. "You Hart," he called out, though he already knew. Ezekiel stepped onto the porch, calm as ever, hat in hand. "I am." Maddox eyed the women behind him. "Heard tell you've taken in some strays. 5 of 'em, all young, all women." "That sound about right." Ezekiel didn't look back at them. "They're under my roof. That's all you need to know." Maddox chuckled, slow and joyless. "That ain't how the law works. Got folks in town talkin'. They say it don't look proper. 5 women on one man's land? Some say it ain't just hospitality you're offering." June flinched at that. Delia dropped the apple she was holding. Magnolia's eyes narrowed. "We ain't done nothing wrong," she said, stepping forward. "We work. We keep to ourselves. We haven't hurt a soul." The sheriff turned to her. "Didn't say you had. But you're fugitives. Preacher Sanders in Abilene sent a wire. Said some girls up and vanished from his camp last month. Claimed they were under his care." "We ran," Clara said, voice low but steady. "Ran from him, not to trouble." Maddox shrugged. "That may be. But there's still the matter of law and reputation." Ezekiel took a slow step forward. His voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. "They're staying." The deputies shifted in their saddles. One reached for his belt, the movement subtle but loud in the space between words. Maddox didn't blink. "You willing to stake your name on that, Hart? If it comes to it, if they bring trouble." "I already have," Ezekiel said. "You'll not take them." "Not today." Silence stretched. Then, like a spark in dry grass, Delia moved. She walked up beside Ezekiel, her small hand wrapping around his. "I ain't goin' back," she said softly. "Ain't never felt safe till I came here." The others followed. One by one, the women stepped up, forming a line beside him. Magnolia last. She didn't touch him, didn't say a word, just stood shoulder to shoulder, her chin high. It wasn't rebellion. It was reclamation. Maddox looked at them, this strange wall of quiet defiance, and his smirk faltered. The prairie wind rose behind them, dry and insistent. "You've made your choice," he said. "If this goes bad, it's on your head." Ezekiel didn't reply. The sheriff and his men turned and rode off, kicking dust and threats in their wake. When the sound of hooves faded, no one moved for a long time. Finally, Magnolia exhaled. "We stood," she said, almost in disbelief. "We stood our ground." That night, supper was simple: cornbread, beans, coffee, but it tasted richer than any feast. The bunkhouse glowed like a lantern in the dark, warm and golden. Laughter came easier. Even June sang again, her voice threading through the rafters like silk. Delia clung to Ezekiel's sleeve for a moment before bed, whispering a thank you she didn't have words for. Ezekiel didn't answer. He just gave her a nod, the kind that meant more than 1,000 sermons. In the weeks that followed, the girls began to plant root. Magnolia started a garden: radishes, onions, wildflowers. June taught Ruth to play harmonica. Clara repaired the broken water pump, her hands moving with confidence. Delia spent mornings brushing horses, afternoons watching clouds. Each of them carved out a new shape of life in the bones of the old ranch. And Ezekiel? He changed in ways he never spoke of. He still rose early, still worked hard, but his silence now held something gentler. When he sat on the porch, it wasn't to escape the world, it was to be near it. He listened more, smiled sometimes, and once even allowed Delia to place a flower behind his ear, though he scowled as she giggled. He never asked for anything, never needed to. The transformation was not loud or sudden. It came in steady increments, in shared work, in mutual care, in quiet resilience. The ranch, once a monument to grief, had become a refuge not because it was perfect, but because the people within it chose to hold space for each other's pain. And yet, under the peace, they all knew life was not done testing them. Out there, beyond the fence line, the world still turned, still watched, still judged. But now they stood ready. As the season turned and the wind carried the scent of rain across the plains, Ezekiel sat on his porch, boots dusty, heart steadied, watching the women move like sunbeams through the ranch yard. He didn't speak, but inside, the silence had changed shape. It no longer echoed, it sang.